had to flee with his parents to Egypt because of Herod the Great, who was one of these Roman governors, or these Roman representatives in Israel and in Judea as well. So, what was the Roman tradition surrounding what we now call Christmas? The Roman god Saturn, which then became the name of the planet Saturn, has roots in a Greek god named Cronus, who is the god of time. And Cronus is believed to have birthed all the great Greek gods, the 12 Olympians, he and his wife. And it was prophesied to him after several of these births that one of them would one day overthrow him. And so Cronus began to grow afraid, and he would devour his children as they came out of his wife's womb. He would actually eat them. However, his wife, appalled by this, was on maybe her 9th child, or whatever the order was, and she decided she'd play a little trick on her husband. So she had her baby in secret, and then she hid her baby, and instead she swaddled or wrapped up a rock. And she took this rock, and she pretended it as if she was nursing it. And Cronus, he came to her, and he saw her swaddling, and he just grabbed what she had in her hands, and he chucked it in his mouth, and he swallowed. And he swallowed the rock instead of swallowing Zeus, the sun. Well, in the meantime, Zeus grew and became powerful, and the Romans called Zeus Jupiter. And one day, Zeus was powerful enough to challenge Cronus and to actually send Cronus to hell, to Hades. And so Cronus is now, Father Time, is now bound in Hades. So, what does this have to do with Christmas? Well, that's one tradition surrounding Cronus or Saturn. Another tradition is that before he was sent to Hades and bound by his own son for eating his brothers and sisters, and by the way, Zeus made him vomit up the brothers and sisters because they're immortal, they're gods, right? So they don't die in the stomach. It's kind of like Jonah and the whale. So he made them vomit up his brothers and sisters. In the meantime, it's thought that Saturn for a period fled from Greece, where it's called Cronus, and he came to Italy. And in Italy, he set up sort of this ideal golden age. And so Saturn ruled in Italy, in what is now Rome, for a period that was called the Golden Age. And so this author, Hesiod, in his Works and Days, speaks about how it was an egalitarian society. There were no slaves and there were no masters. It was a society where there wasn't strife, there wasn't conflict, there wasn't warfare. And so in this golden period, Saturn then becomes associated with wealth and becomes the god of wealth. Well, Pluto and Saturn both have an association with wealth. Now, if you've been to Rome, this is a kind of a fuzzy picture of the Roman Forum. And here, like you have the Arch of Septimus Severus. Here, you have the Temple of Saturn. Now, this was the first temple built in the Roman Forum. And this was the temple that housed the treasury. And every year, around December 25, it would begin about December 17, and then go to around December 25, there was a 7 or 8 day celebration called the Saturnalia. The Saturnalia was a very kind of raucous affair. There was lots of wine served. Even the children were encouraged to drink and partake. And, very interestingly, the masters and the slaves switched places. So if you were a slave, you were actually served by your master. And so it was this great role reversal, just as Saturn was thought to have this golden age. So in Rome, they kind of recreated what they thought was a golden age with lots of drinking and merriment and masters and slaves switching places and also gift giving. And so in the Saturnalia, we have this first tradition of around what we now call Christmas, exchanging gifts. So, this plays, oops, wrong direction. This is the influence from the south, from the Mediterranean. Now, there was a more, you might even say, pagan or a more harsh influence from the north on the Christmas tradition. In Scandinavia, in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, and in Germany, they celebrated Yule. Now, Yule was a god, and around Christmas, when you celebrated his holiday, around the winter solstice, you would do so by cutting down an evergreen tree and taking the log and throwing it in the fire and keeping this fire stoked for a period of 12 days. And if you're thinking the 12 days of Christmas, you're right, there's a connection here. So, this fire was stoked for 12 days. On each day, a sacrifice was made to the god Yule. So for instance, in the earliest of these kind of Nordic societies, it would be a human sacrifice. Later, it was only an animal sacrifice. But something was sacrificed in the Yule fire each of these 12 days. Now this is not a picture of Yule. Though the Yule log and the festival is named for this northern god Yule, it actually became most associated with the god Odin. Now, in Norse mythology, Odin is sort of the king of Valhalla, or the king of the pantheon. And he's one of my favorite characters in myth. You can see, if you look closely, that he's missing an eye there. And eventually, he actually gives up his other eye. And he does this, he gives up both eyes in exchange for information, for wisdom. There were critical moments where he was on an adventure and someone said, I will give you this bit of knowledge if you give me your eye. And so he actually plucked his eye out and he gave it to the person. So Odin has this ancient association with wisdom. And eventually, when both his eyes were gone, in lieu of them, he had two ravens that would sit on his shoulders. And he would send the ravens out and they would gather information for him and bring it back. Now, take a close look at this figure. Does he look like anyone? A more sinister version.
Santa Claus.
Santa Claus, exactly. So Odin had this great beard, as the tradition would have it, and he would ride around during the 12 days of Yule, and if you were caught outside and Odin saw you, he would make a decision about whether or not you would survive into the next year. So you didn't want to be caught outside, you didn't want Odin to see you. It was sort of an early naughty or nice. Now, because of this, during the 12 days, people would try to get inside. They didn't want to be caught outside. Inside, what would it look like? Well, you would take evergreen leaves and you would deck the mead hall. You would cover the hall with evergreens. You would also set up a giant tree. Not just the tree that you're burning in the fire in the center of the mead hall, but a tree that you may decorate. Now, why is it that they chose the evergreen tree? Anyone want to venture a guess? Why the evergreen tree? Is the Christmas tree. Right.
They don't die, they change color.
Exactly. One of the few trees that in winter is a non-deciduous tree, so it lasts the winter, right? And so the hope was that, oh, we too will last the winter. We too will go through the winter green and hale and healthy. And so this symbol was taken and was put all around. And so you were inside, you gathered around the fire, you didn't go outside because you tried, outside were the evil spirits of that season of the year, the darkest season of the year. So you would stay inside. So this tradition of 12 days, this tradition of the Christmas tree, this tradition of decorating with evergreens became very popular. So all this was in existence at the time of the birth of Christ. Now, when was Jesus Christ born?
4 BC. 4 years before Christ.
Okay, right, okay, yeah. 4 years before Christ was born. 4 years, and maybe 4 BC.
Yeah, that's what I mean to say.
Right. It may also be 7 BC. We're not really sure what date exactly Christ was born. We are also not sure when in the calendar year Christ was born. We don't really know. And what's interesting is the Gospels don't tell us. They don't mention anything about December 25. In fact, though there are clues in there, they really don't mention anything about what season of the year it is. Now, there's a lot of speculation on this. Why might that be? Well, perhaps the Gospel writers, in that day and age, only a kind of a megalomaniac would celebrate their birthday. So if you were a god, or if you were an emperor who thought you were a god, you might celebrate your birthday. But other than that, birthdays, they weren't that big. And so they intentionally, perhaps, some scholars say, because perhaps the Gospel writers did not want people celebrating the birth of Christ. And so they intentionally left it vague. That's one theory. Another theory is, well, we can tell when Christ was born because the shepherds were in the fields at night. And they wouldn't have been in the fields at night unless it was in the spring when the sheep were ewing, when they were having their lambs. And so the shepherds needed to be out in the field to make sure that the birth process went safely and well. Sort of, there is no veterinarian that you can take your lamb or your sheep to. So you kind of played jack of all trades. You did everything. So you were out in the field making sure everything went well, even at night. So perhaps Christ was born in the spring. Or perhaps he was born in the fall, around the time when Zechariah goes into the temple. It would have been around September, October. And so if we can say, we know when Zechariah went to the temple and when God struck him mute, and then we know a little bit after that when Mary visited Elizabeth, and the announcement was made that Mary was with child, so that would have been maybe about December. And then if the conception happened in December, well then perhaps in September he was born, which I like because I was born in September. So the idea of having Christ born in September, I love it. So, there's many competing theories. Now, why was December 25th? Of all, it could have been in the spring that he was born, it could have been in September that he was born. Why was December 25th chosen? There's two versions to this story. One version has it that the Christians began to celebrate, we don't have a record of it, but perhaps they began to celebrate the birth of Christ in December. And for that reason, the Roman rulers made it a holiday because they didn't want Christians taking their worshipers, because there were hundreds of years there when it was sort of up in the air. Would Christianity be the dominant religion, or would Zeus and kind of the pagan pantheon be the religion of the Mediterranean, and then from beyond there into Asia and Africa? So in this tension, one version has it that Christmas, or that season of the year, became more important. The Saturnalia became more important because it was a competitor to the Christian Christmas. Another version of it has it, however, that Pope Gregory the Great, this man, a fascinating man, he was a very gifted songwriter, and he had a passion for sending out missionaries. So he sent missionaries all over the known world to preach about Christianity. And his missionaries went out, they went into the north, and guess what they encountered? They encountered this tradition of the Yule log, and the Yule celebration, and the 12 days surrounding the god Odin and the god Yule and kind of this Nordic mythology. And so they wrote back to Pope Gregory the Great and they said, what do we do? There were some missionaries like Boniface who had an easy solution to it. Worship was centered around trees. So he took an axe and he went out and he said, you believe this tree is worthy of worship? And he just hewed the tree down. He just chopped it down, right? Problem solved. What, you're going to worship it now? I just chopped it down. So some missionaries were sort of very confrontational about this. However, Pope Gregory the Great said, why don't, instead of being very confrontational about this, you use this celebration to communicate the birth of Christ and the incarnation and the coming of Christ into the world. And so, Pope Gregory the Great encouraged his missionaries to incorporate this Christmas celebration into their calendar year and into the schedule of their church. So, major influence here around the 7th century. Now, as Christmas was incorporated, several things happened. The Saturnalia, in its tradition of drinking and kind of raucous behavior where society is turned upside down, that festive spirit came into Christianity with a vengeance. And so, the kind of peaceful and silent night Christmases that we know now, or even kind of the exchange-based consumer Christmases that we know now, at the time, it looked nothing like that. It was more like an orgy. It was the most dangerous time of year, the 12 days of Christmas, in the Middle Ages, to be out. You wouldn't want to be out in the streets because it is literally physically dangerous. There's a great degree of violence because of all the drinking that happened. There was open sex in the streets. It became a time of real debauchery. And so around the 12th century, in St. Francis, in January, we're going to be looking at spiritual leaders. So for instance, Martin Luther, James Lake, who's the founder of Union Church, St. Francis, and some other great leaders. St. Francis, apart from Peter, Paul, Mary, John, and Jesus, may be one of the most significant figures in Christianity. And one of his many influences is he created the first nativity scene. Growing up in an era where Christmas was a dangerous time to go out, and it was really a debauched time, he wanted to reclaim this, and he thought that the best way to do this is through drama or through theater. So, he set up the first nativities, the first live nativities. And what he did is he took some of his followers, some of his brothers, and he dressed them up as magi and as shepherds, and he asked for some sheep and a donkey and all that, and he put together a live manger. This quickly spread, and within a few years, popes were saying every church around Italy should have, as an Italian saint, every church around Italy should do a live nativity at Christmas. And from there, it's kind of spread throughout the world. And so St. Francis, in an effort to, Pope Gregory, in an effort to spread Christianity, says, let's have a Christmas holiday. However, in taking on some pagan customs, it went so far in the direction of these pagan customs that then by the time of St. Francis, almost 6 centuries later, he has to move it back in the other direction and remind people that it's not about the drinking and other things, or even the gift-giving, but it is about the birth of Christ. So, St. Francis, significant figure. Now, in the Renaissance was a period of kind of great wealth in Europe and then elsewhere in Asia as well. It's a real boom time. And here we have, around the Christmas celebration, a consumerism that enters society. And I think it's represented here well in this painting. This painting was done by Botticelli. He's probably most famous for his Spring or Birth of Venus, But here what he's done is his big funders, the Medici family, the De Medicis, commissioned him to paint this painting and to put them in it. So you notice, it's a nativity, like St. Francis liked. You know, we have the child and Mary and Joseph, and in the background we have sort of these pastures and fields with the livestock. But we also have, a little pointer here, this is Cosimo de' Medici himself. And so Cosimo wanted himself very prominently featured, right, showing his homage to Christ. So this is a statement about his power and his nearness to God. Now, what's unusual about this is Cosimo de' Medici is a banker. And bankers in that day and age did not have a good reputation. They were considered somewhat parasitic. And so if you were if you were a priest or if you were a scholar or something like that, you had a good reputation. But the De Medici family actually changed this perception of bankers as parasitic, and after them, bankers became, at least in European society, became very well respected after the De Medici family. So, here you have Cosimo. Here you have his son Piero, and then on the sides you have Giuliano and Lorenzo. Now, if you take a look at the stance here, you know, this is a very proud family. He's not, now Cosimo may be touching the feet of Christ, but his grandsons aren't too worried about Christ, are they, right? So, the whole Christmas tradition, by the time of the Renaissance and this growing period of wealth, really becomes more about the consumer aspect of things and a chance to show off your status, your financial status. Now, in 1652, King Charles in England was beheaded. This was a time of great upheaval, the English Civil War. So we have Charles Cromwell against the king. And Cromwell, what was his basis of support? And why did the Civil War happen? His basis of support was a group known as the Puritans. And the Puritans were a Protestant Christian group who wanted to literally go back to the pure elements of the faith. So they wanted to do away with the pagan influences. They wanted to do away with this whole, debauched Christmas tradition. They wanted to do away with the consumerism around Christmas. And so, they reduced Christmas to, it was literally a Christmas, just another service, right? But there was no tree, there were no evergreens, because they knew what this stuff meant. There was no Yule log that you threw on the fire. All that was gone. And in fact, Christmas celebrations were outlawed under Cromwell. So you didn't give gifts to people in England in 1653 or 54, for several years there when Cromwell was in power. Now, just to pause here, the Puritans, and around this time, you've seen this is just a great piece of trivia. Where does Xmas come from? Does anyone know? Yes, Samson.
Greek.
Excellent, very good. So in Greek, Christos or Christ, Christmas was literally the Christ Mass or the Christ service. And if you shorten that and you have the Mass afterwards and you wanted to shorten this, this is a chi, which when transliterated from the Greek, it sounds like CH, right? So that's where we get our spelling of Christ. So if you shorten this and you take out the rest of Christ's name, you just get Xmas, right? It looks to us like an X, but it's actually the Greek letter chi. So a little piece of trivia that even Xmas, very centered here on Christ. So the Puritans, their objective was to recenter people on Christ. Now, coming from the States, this was sort of a critical moment in history, because when Cromwell was defeated and the monarchy was restored in England, Puritans were no longer in power. In fact, they had to flee. So they fled to the Netherlands, or they fled to what was known as the New World, right? To what is now the United States and elsewhere. And in the United States, what do you think they did? What do you think their view of Christmas was? Not positive, right? So they came and they outlawed Christmas. And so for the first for the first couple hundred years of U.S. history, Christmas was actually outlawed. Most of the states, first the colonies and then most of the states, had rules about how you could and could not celebrate Christmas. In fact, in one of his sermons, an early leader of the colonies, Cotton Mather, talks to his congregation about how is it, why would you even think that by drinking and by celebrating a pagan festival, you do honor to the incarnation of Christ? And so even in that sermon, we see that there's this tension here where he sees it as a problem. Probably people in his church, even though they're a good Puritan church, are still tempted around Christmas to go out and have a good time, right? And so he has to speak against this. So, Puritanism influences the Netherlands, it influences England, it then comes to the United States. Now, the English and kind of through the English, the American tradition comes into play here in Hong Kong. Many of the songs that you hear when you go into the grocery store in Hong Kong are either American carols or carols that were produced in England, for instance by Wesley, the founder of Methodism. So I'm looking here at the English and kind of American traditions of Christmas because through the British, it's played a formative role in how Christmas is celebrated here in Hong Kong. So what changed? Because now in the US, Christmas is huge, right? So what changed? Well, it began with this man, Washington Irving. Washington Irving was a very colorful figure, and as a young man, he decided he wanted to become a writer. However, he was worried about getting his first book published. So, he decided he would play a trick on New York society where he lived. And this is what he did. He put out an advertisement in the newspaper saying that a visiting historian to New York, this very esteemed historian named Knickerbocker, had gone missing. He vanished from his hotel. So he put out a missing persons report. In all New York society, because this was a visiting professor, and they didn't want to look bad, we lost the visiting professor, all New York society started to really follow this story in the inquiry into the visiting professor. And really, it was Washington Irving just making up these reports and just selling them in the newspaper. Why was he doing this? He was doing this because he had written a history of New York from the beginning of time to, I think, the English invasion, something like that was the title. And he used, even though he wrote it, he used an alias, Friedrich Knickerbocker, the very person who he said had gone missing, this professor. So, when he finally published his book, it was under the name of Friedrich Knickerbocker, this professor who had gone missing, and because he was following in all these reports, was by now famous, because everyone was out looking for Professor Knickerbocker. So, when his book came out, naturally, and he said they found it in the hotel room, naturally, everyone wanted to buy the book, right? So, Washington Irving, after that, writes this work that I put in the sources, and that is Geoffrey Crane. And Geoffrey Crane is sort of this figure who goes around New York and the Hudson Valley, and he finds out folklore and traditions around New York society. So that's where we get the legend of Sleepy Hollow. and other great Rip Van Winkle and other famous works from Washington Irving. But in there, he wrote about celebrating Christmas. And there was this family, the Bracebridge family, who really celebrated Christmas in New York. And he went to their mansion and he celebrated it with them, and then he wrote about it in this book, which became a very kind of wildly popular book. So, because of him, people began to become interested in Christmas again. Now, Washington Irving is one of the few American authors who had any respect in England. You know, most Americans were like the frontiersmen who were kind of bimbos. However, Washington Irving caught the attention of Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens wrote his Christmas Carol for two reasons. One was, in English society at the time, he witnessed intimately the plight of the poor. When he was young, Charles Dickens, this famous author, when he was young, his father was sent to prison, sent to debtor's prison, because he could not pay his debts. Because of that, young Dickens, to feed his family, had to drop out of school at age 12 and actually got a job working in a factory. Now, because until age 12 he had a comfortable life, he wasn't very good working in this factory. And so all the other young children in the factory made fun of him. So it was a very traumatic experience. But because of this experience, he always had a heart for people in a bad situation. And so, previous to writing A Christmas Carol, he began to tour, for instance, what was the region? Concord. He began to tour the tin factories there and saw the appalling things that were done to children. They were used up by age 25. So he writes this book, A Christmas Carol, sort of a protest on the poverty of the time. He also writes it to restore the joviality of Christmas and the joy of Christmas. And so Charles Dickens, with Washington Irving, begins to write about Christmas. Now, his work becomes wildly popular in all the colonies and in all the former colonies, including the U.S. So when he comes to the U.S., he creates a great stir because it's illegal, right, in all the states to, in some form, celebrate Christmas. But here is Charles Dickens giving all these book tours, and he's reading A Christmas Carol, which is celebrating Christmas. So this man, Thomas Nast, decides that he's going to begin to draw cartoons of Father Christmas. And this is where I want to kind of conclude our talk tonight. Thomas Nast was quite an amazing figure himself. He was an ambassador to Spain, grew up similar to Dickens, had a very rough childhood. He was a high school dropout. And he decided to take on the biggest gangsters in New York. It was sort of the Triad of New York, Boss Tweed. And he took them on by drawing cartoons of them that would mock them. And he was so good at mocking them that the gangsters came to him. Boss Tweed sent his representative to him and said, I will give you $100,000 US. Now back then that's a huge sum. This is in the 19th century. I'll give you $100,000 US if you just take a paid vacation to Europe for 6 years and leave me alone. Well, he didn't say yes. And so they kept coming back with offers until it was $500,000, which is, again, this massive fortune if we adjust for inflation. At the end of it, however, he said publicly, you know what, I set out to put Boss Tweed behind bars, and I'm not going to stop. So he continued to draw his cartoons. And it is said that his cartoons, perhaps more than anything else, are what put this gangster, Boss Tweed, behind bars. So, Thomas Nast is perhaps most famous, though, for his representations of St. Nicholas, or Santa Claus. Every year, he would draw a Santa Claus for the Sentinel, the big paper in New York. And over the years, he perfected this, and this is about year 12. Of him drawing St. Nick. Now, who is St. Nicholas? In Turkey, in the little town of Myra, a man was born about 4th century. He was named Nicholas. He was born to very wealthy parents, but his parents died when he was young. And St. Nicholas used his fortune to begin helping the poor. He was a committed Christian. There was a family in the town that had 3 daughters. The problem was that the father could not afford the dowry for his daughters. So, in that day and age, as in many societies throughout the world, if you wanted to marry someone, you, as a woman, had to provide, you or your family had to provide a big gift to the husband's family to make it a suitable arrangement. And so, this poor father, with his 3 daughters, didn't have enough money to give them dowries, and therefore, his daughter's only option was probably to go into prostitution. St. Nicholas heard of this, and St. Nicholas was a very shy man. He was under 5 feet tall, he was about 4'11", and he didn't like the spotlight at all, but he really wanted to help his family. So what he did is on the eve before the big proposal was to be made by this poor father of these 3 daughters for his oldest daughter to get married, and he was without the dowry, and so everyone knew the proposal was going to go bad the next day, right? St. Nicholas filled the bag of gold, and he came around, and he tossed it in the window, and then he ran away. They picked up the gold, and next day, they went to the proposal, made perfectly, right? Eldest daughter, sold off or married off, right? Good family, good story. Well, next year, the second-born daughter, it was her turn. She had to get married, right? Either get married or become a prostitute. 2 options. So St. Nicholas, again, fills a bag of gold. In the eve of the big proposal, he goes to the window of this poor man's house and he chucks in the bag of gold. Well, the family starts becoming suspicious, right? Because by the 3rd daughter, on the eve the night before, they're all in anticipation. So they're inside the house just waiting for Nicholas to come along with the bag. They don't know who it is, but they're just waiting. And Nicholas catches wind of this, that he's about to be ambushed and his whole generosity is going to be revealed. So, what does he do? The houses are connected to each other, and he climbs up on the roofs, and he decides to take this bag of gold and toss it down the chimney. However, the youngest daughter had gotten her socks wet that day, and so she hung up her socks to dry over the fire. Well, that bag of gold, guess where it went? It went right into that sock, if you can believe it. And so, when they found the gold, it was there in the stocking. Now, you probably recognize this is hanging the stockings on Christmas Eve and putting gifts in the stockings. And this is supposedly where this whole tradition comes from. So St. Nicholas, who I believe is a real figure, a real historical figure, and there's many other stories associated with him. There was an evil butcher in town who in a famine invited children into his house, and he butchered them and he put them in 3 barrels to cure them, as sort of like you would cure a ham. St. Nicholas, he discerns this. He walks into the house, he brings the legal authorities, has the barrels open, prays over them, children are resurrected. So there's many, this is a great saint. In fact, he's so great that he's the most beloved saint in many countries, including Russia and in Greece. So if you go to Russia or Greece, you see icons of St. Nicholas all over the place. So he's not just Santa Claus. But through the English tradition, and then in Hong Kong and also where I'm from in the States, St. Nicholas has become Santa Claus. Now, there's many other works of art that we could go into. Like, if you haven't read this story, O. Henry's The Gift of the Magi, he's a brilliant author who always has a twist in his stories. And this is kind of a wonderful Christmas story. He began writing in prison. His real name is not O. Henry, but because he was a prisoner, he had to publish under a pseudonym. And so O. Henry writes, another very moving work is George Friedrich Handel's Messiah. And the whole first part of Handel's Messiah is telling the story of Christmas. It's the incarnation. And he draws on these passages like Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 9 that predict the Parthenos, or the virgin birth. And so I think it's important to us to kind of treasure up, and it's not only in Western culture now, but to treasure up these great artistic expressions of Christmas, and to also value these traditions. However, I think the question I'd like to leave you with is, what do we do with the pagan influence on the Christmas holiday? Is this something to be embraced, like Pope Gregory thought, and therefore embrace other cultures? As long as we keep the focus on Christ, we can draw from other cultures and incorporate their celebrations into ours. Or is this something, since essentially when we bring a Christmas tree into the home, we're bringing an idol into the home, it's something that in Norse mythology was worshipped, is it something that we need to be wary of? And so I kind of leave that as a thought to you. There's a great story behind Christmas, and I think one of the best ways to enjoy Christmas is just to begin reading up on these stories. They're fascinating and wonderful. So, there's the story of Christ and His coming, and then there's the story of how Christ and His coming has been celebrated by Christians over the past 2 millennia. And it makes a fascinating mosaic. So please, this Christmas, take some time to do some of your own research and think about this. And that's the Well for Sunday. All right.